Hi everyone, my name is Jeremy, I work for Home Tree and I'm here to introduce our guest speaker, Seán Ó Gaoithín. He doesn't really need much introduction. Seán's an author, he is the head gardener of Glenveagh National Park and he's a long-time advocate of woodland restoration, especially in Donegal. So he's going to talk to you a bit about his research for his book and many other things, I assume.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start by just giving you a tiny little introduction to how this happened. So I bumped into the Donegal Heritage Officer about a year and a half ago, and I just having a casual conversation with him, and I said, "Is there any grants to do a book on the Woodlands of Donegal? I'd love to do a book on the Woodlands of Donegal." I've done a few other smaller little books, like this one on the ancient woodlands of Glenveagh. That was for Glenveagh. Anyway, cut a long story short, we got 10,000 from the National Parks and Wildlife Service from their biodiversity fund. So the National Parks and Wildlife Service gives about 100,000 to every county in the Republic, to all the county councils, to spend on raising awareness of biodiversity. So they all get a big budget, right? And I got a little slice of that. And that money, 10,000, went straight to the people who produced the book. So we produced 1,000 of these things. And so it's like a local publication. So then I had the complete pleasure of going around. What I did was I looked at there's an inventory of our native woodlands that National Parks and Wildlife commissioned in 2008. Okay, that's the first time the Irish state has set about finding out where are they, it was a mapping exercise. There's about 1,000 of these native woodlands that have been identified in the country. Yeah, so all the counties of Ireland have them, north and south. And that list now is being worked on a second time. The Maynooth University are going to start doing the ground truthing for the next level of actually going into this 1,000 woodlands and seeing what's there and seeing what needs to be done. Right? So that survey then, with the information from that survey, the National Parks and Wildlife also commissioned an inventory of possible ancient woodlands in the country. Yeah, I can't remember how many of them there are, but there are hundreds of potential ancient woodlands in the country, and in Donegal there are 30. So I used that list for my I needed some way of kind of putting some kind of shape on what I was going to do. So I profiled about 30 woodlands in the book. So I went and I visited them all, and I knew many of them anyway. Some of them I've never seen before. And I also went and visited a couple of recently established native woodlands because, you see, in the native woodland scheme, you can get grants to restore a woodland or you can get grants to establish a woodland. So there was an amazing example in Donegal of a private estate, 100-acre woodland that cleared their cherry laurel and their rhododendron 20 years ago. And now they have fantastic regeneration going on. It's actually a fantastic example of woodland restoration. And then there's another example of Rafe and Liz Shepherd. They again planted a native woodland at the very beginning of the native woodland scheme in 1999. And now they have these fantastic woodlands coming up in their farm as well. So I'm going to give you an example. Now, there's a relationship between what I've just said and this image here, because there are a number of criteria that are used to identify or say this is an ancient woodland. And one of them is that there is documented evidence that this woodland existed in the 1600s. Yeah, that's a basic criteria. So if there's a map that exists that says this woodland was in this place and it's still there now, we can be pretty confident that it's an ancient woodland. There's also the species mix, the range of species, but also the diversity of species. When it goes beyond a certain threshold and you start to get these really rare things appearing in an ancient woodland, that's also a fantastic indicator that these native woodland species have been there for centuries, and they're very much what they call an indicator species. But like oak is an indicator species. It's the most obvious one of the lot. If you have native oak, It's a pretty good indicator that this is an ancient woodland. So this particular illustration is from Derek's The Image of Ireland. And this guy, Derek, was produced this illustrated book of the comings and goings and the carryings on of what was going on in Ireland in, what's the date there? 1581. And what you're actually looking at is a wood cairn. This is a woodland inhabiting Irish person, yeah? The point I just want to make at this point is, the Irish were a woodland people 500 years ago. We're not now. So it's not too far back, right? It's, and it's also relational to how we understand our ancient woodlands. So this is an amazing map of Ulster from, does it say it there somewhere? It does, 1602, slightly later. And what you're looking at, this is this guy William Bartlett, and it's his general description of Ulster in 1602. He was a map maker for the British Crown. The British Crown were engaged in the conquest of both Scotland and Ireland at that stage. So in a sense, they wanted to know what was there. So Bartlett produced this very accurate map showing where all the different tribes were, where their castles are, where their woodlands are, where their rivers are, like all basic natural resources and political resources that the English needed to know about in order to be able to strategize. And this particular character, William Bartlett, was assassinated by the O'Donnells because they didn't want map makers in their territory for obvious reasons, right? There was a conquest going on. So, but fair dues to William Bartlett, he was a very good map maker. And this is our best record of where the woodlands are I'm particularly interested in Donegal, this whole huge western part of Ulster. Now, what he maps incredibly accurately is particularly East Donegal, or East Ulster. So you can see all these amazing woodlands all around Lough Neagh. They're all gone now, yeah? Only the place names survive. But what was going on at that time was the Irish were using, the Irish burnt a lot of their castles so the English wouldn't get them, and they just went on the move. And the likes of Red Hugh O'Donnell and Hugh O'Neill, these Ulster Earls who were opposing the English conquest, all their wealth was tied up in cattle. Yeah, so like for example, Hugh O'Neill, he had 100,000 cattle. Now he didn't have them all in one place. That would have been in many herds, and the Irish had been doing this for generations anyway, where they had these travelling herders called creats, yeah, and the creats were these nomadic people that travelled with the herd, and in times of trouble, they brought them into the woods where you could hide them. So there's a long-standing relationship between grazing and cattle being in our native woodlands. That goes back into prehistory, but it continues to this day. You find lots of woodlands to this day, native woodlands. I was in one this morning in the Burren where there's cows grazing underneath the hazel. Yeah, so that's an ancient practice, and there's a dynamic there. But anyway, the problem was that the woodlands were also seen as a place where the Irish could hide. So the woodlands were removed. They were destroyed because that's where the rebels were. Yeah, it was also where the wolves were, and the wolves were hunted to extinction at the same time as any of the Irish who were opposing the English. So they were kind of desperate places. Like the woodlands became these places of slaughter and hunting grounds sort of thing in that particular period. The only other thing I wanted to tell you about this map was it's really accurate for this side, but really Bartlett had no idea of the inner makeup of inner Donegal. He maps the coast extremely well, and all the river systems are quite good. So we can see that the Finn River, for example, has woodlands along it. There are still woodlands in those places. On Lough Swilly, there are woodlands in places where there are still woodlands, like Rathmullen Woods. Now, he only has one big lake in the middle of Donegal. That's completely inaccurate. He had no idea what was going on because he really probably didn't even get in there to have a good look. But like, there's woodlands on the edge of this lake. That could be somewhere like Glenveagh. In South Donegal, for example, there's various woodlands in the south of the county. They're all associated mostly with river systems. That's really kind of significant because, you know, the river systems are also these ecological corridors, and that's how the oaks move up and down rivers. So, first example is one of the finest examples of a native woodlands probably in the country. So in that native woodland survey that I was telling you about, they also rated the woodlands, and 3 of the Donegal woodlands came within the top 10 in the country of being in the highest level of conservation status or level. In other words, they were in the best shape, yeah, for species diversity, for their ability to be able to regenerate, their stability. So this particular woodland is Ardnamona Woods in South Donegal. It's on Loch Esk, and you can see the oak, and you can also see the wet flushes through the oak, and that's ash, hazel, alder, wet flushes. So a lot of the time when you go into these native woodlands, it's just one thing. It's like just a bit of oak or just a bit of hazel. But in Ardnamona, there's a number of dynamics going on. So it's a more complex habitat because there's rivers, yeah, running through the woods. You've got all these aquatic systems and wet systems. So that's what makes it much more diverse, yeah. So on the drier ground, you have the Quercus petraea, and on the wetter ground, you have willow and alder and hazel and interesting flora. That's a slightly closer look at the woodlands. You can see the same thing again. These are my drone shots. So I invested in a little drone, and it was really nice to be able to look at the woods from above to get a real sense of them, and then go into them, and you get a completely different sense. So this is the avenue that runs through the woods, and it's a mile-long avenue that's part of a little domain called the Ardnamona domain. There's the Ardnamona house. It's a historic house. It was planted with rhododendrons and the usual stuff. Ardnamona Woods is absolutely ancient. It's very clear it's been there for a long time. It hasn't been declared ancient yet. There's only a handful of actual woodlands in the country that have been given the tick that it's been properly ecologically assessed. More of that work is going to follow. But this mile-long avenue runs through the woods, and I discovered this for the first time about 40 years ago, and I just couldn't believe my eyes that this thing existed. And the reason why it existed is because it was in private ownership for a long, long time, and the people who owned it just wanted it. Yeah? And so private ownership has been a very important element of how these things have survived in many cases. Yeah, not all cases, but in many cases. So in Ardnamona Woods, you have the Killarney fern and you have the bird's nest orchid. I love using the Gaelic names of plants because sometimes they give you incredible insight into our own values, the Irish values of our plants that are not English names or Latin names, which is great. So we have a very rich tradition in Gaelic names. That also is true of our place names. I'm going to deal with that in a while too. We also have the Tunbridge filmy fern in Ardnamona, Dinnseanchas. That's a beautiful name, for a native plant. And look at this, Jadulog for the common twayblade. Mongan, what do you make of that?
Jadulog, honey ass, yeah, of all the low, 2 leaves. Double leafed.
Is it?
What do you think?
Is it not like a god leaf?
Ask Roisin about there. I'm not.
I don't know. Need a Sam. I don't know. But
Yeah.
it could be a day as a duck, but I would say
It's double.
2.
It's double leaf.
Yeah,
Is
I'd say
it? 2 leaf. Fair enough. Okay. But look at the flowers. They're like little men. They're like little creatures.
But there's 2.
Yeah.
2 pieces hanging off it.
Brilliant woodland habitat, bird's nest orchid. There's woodpeckers have now established themselves in the place. They just made their own way there. There's last year for the first time the white-tailed eagle started nesting in Ardnamona all by itself. The red squirrels have moved back in. So that's as a result of the whole of Loch Esk becoming much more forested, which includes a lot of spruce plantation. But because there's more volume of woodland around the whole area, it supports the ancient woodland as a really good centre for it all, you could say, yeah? If that makes sense. In the wet flushes, you get this marvellous mix of watermint and sedge, which is very different kind of woodland flora to what you would typically see. Usually you're just looking at, stuff in dry soil. Ash dieback is a major phenomenon at the moment. It's extremely worrying. We could be witnessing an extinction event. We may well be witnessing an extinction event. The prognosis is not great. My understanding is that basically our ash has no resistance to this Asian fungus. And what all the experience from abroad, you all know this probably anyway, we're potentially losing one of our handful of native trees, which is a colossal. So that's going to change. It is changing, and it's going to be even bigger, the change of the constituents of our native woodlands, and that's going to have a kind of a cascade effect. So I don't know what, I go between despair and hope about how things are going to shape up, So now this is relational to ash. This is another woodland site in South Donegal called Carrickabrini, which translates as the she palace of the rock. Yeah, so it's a Carrickabrunia, and it's many of our native woodland sites have fairy folklore associated with them. They're always associated with the elementals and the places that are inhabited by the wild she. So that's an example of it there. This particular woodland is on limestone, so it's the ash hazel association, and there's also very good wych elm in this woodland as well. That's another very, very rare native tree, the wych elm. So that's and of course wych elm is also threatened by Dutch elm disease. Teagasc are working on a program to try and find disease-resistant strains of the elm that they can be used for planting schemes. So that's inside the Carrickabrini woodland. You've got this ash hazel mix, and because it's high pH, there's a different ground flora to what you would find in a oak woodland, which would be low pH. So there's quite a different mix. Prunus avium is another one that you find in this particular wood. But I was starting to understand that you get a particular species mix depending on the soil type and the geology of the area. So South Donegal has a lot of limestone, and that limestone continues even more so into Fermanagh. Fermanagh would be very similar kinds of mixes. So it's very sad to see what's going on in Fermanagh. There's huge amounts of ash just dying back. It's in all their hedgerows and in their woodlands. A very different woodland in North Donegal in the west. So on Killeen-Darragh. So Killeen-Darragh is the anglicised name for the little oak wood. This is a really interesting place because this is an example of a location where you can see field systems in the wood. So the native woodland has completely regenerated all by itself and reoccupied land that was farmed around the time of the famine. Like, that's amazing. So there are examples of that. I visited a couple of examples of it in Donegal, but there would be examples of that all over the country where land use has changed, and because of the famine and various dynamics, you get these regenerations going on. So ancient wall inside really beautiful woodland. That's the same woodland from above. There's a little bit of lodgepole pine planted on the extremity of the place, but you can see the way the oak and the willow and hazel and birch and rowan create these beautiful tapestries in the woodland. You kind of get a better view when the trees are not in leaf. And certain trees, particularly the native trees, particularly oak, are fantastic for lichens. So they have that kind of white appearance. You'll see that again in a minute. And then I was trying to get these kind of capture the woodland flora in the woodlands. So you've got this wonderful mix of primula, lesser celandine, couleron, what's that? Shamsoak is the wood sorrel, and agenin is the ivy. And look, there's a sycamore in the middle of it all. I didn't spot that the first time I took the picture. But like, there's diversity. So sometimes just looking straight down on the forest floor, you'll actually find all your indicators of how old and how rich the mix is. Yeah. And then that's an example of the same woodland again, and that's oak and holly and just moss. They're fantastic. They talk about that like Celtic rainforest. You know, the Western Atlantic oak woodland, or kind of a temperate rainforest, that's becoming a real big deal now. So we're discovering that. I think personally that probably most of Ireland was a temperate Atlantic rainforest going back 10,000 years ago, and we're just looking at the remnants of it. Shamsog is the Irish name for wood sorrel. It's potentially the original shamrock. That's the closest Gaelic name to the anglicised shamrock, and a very typical woodland plant. That's the Guibara estuary. So that's seawater running up into a big fault line that runs through Donegal. Glenveagh is on exactly the same fault line, so that's the same fault line that runs through Scotland as well. But most of these native woodlands are just in private hands and just happen to be there. Nobody's managing them, they're just there. We have National Parks and Wildlife have a nature reserve there. It's called Dirkmore, and the ranger who's looking after that, very interesting discussion with her about the connectivity of all these woodlands. There's so many woodland patches in that whole line that goes for about 20 kilometres from the coast right into the mountains, and it's a really good example of showing how the river system is the kind of basic ecological corridor. And you all know Jason, you know young Jason, the woodlandy fella. I remember having a great chat with him about, he had really strong ideas about how the ecology that spreads in the landscape is really a lot to do with the river systems, yeah? So, and that really is true, yeah? So I wanted to convey that in my book, so I arranged the book according to the river systems of the county. That's further on up the same river system, and in the distance, that's the beginning of Glenveagh National Park, and you've got the big lake and the Castle and Moor Woods. So there's this continuous line of oak that runs as a diagonal up through the county, and that's been there since medieval times, and it's on Bartlett's map, and it's in lots of different people's private land. You know, the reason why these trees are still there is because it's the law that if it's wooded land, you cannot clear fell unless you replace the trees. Yeah, it goes back to 1929. It's one of the first forestry acts, and that's protected a lot of woodland from being felled. Not all of it. A lot of it was cleared, but some of these places people just haven't got round to cutting them down. So, but we have to come up with strategies to try and protect and encourage and allow the spread of these things back out into the landscape. I was looking at the shrub flora in a lot of these places, wonderful examples of different kinds of roses, different kinds of brambles. There are 60 species of brambles that it would take only very few botanists can do brambles. They're just a big mash of different kinds of, but they reckon we have about 60 varieties. I'd love to apply myself to brambles one of these days. I just haven't done it yet. But there's incredible diversity if you start looking at their flowers and their leaves and their growth patterns, and their presence and their importance in woodlands is huge. This is another tiny little woodland. It's called the Fairy Glen by the locals. And it's also known as Owen Alt Derry, which is Owen Alt Derry is the river of the cliffy oak, or the kind of the oak of a ravine, which is a perfectly accurate ecological description of what's there, and that's a medieval name. So we've had our botanical knowledge, and the way we understand our flora and our fauna is also very deeply embedded in our language. I went and I counted all the oaks on this, and there's 70 oaks in this ravine, and nearly none of them ever produce acorns. And I'm like, how did this get here? Because it's just blanket bog on either side. And it crept up the river, basically, from further down where there are bigger trees that have acorns on them. And it's probably jays. So I tell the story of jays in the book. The jays, the Irish jay, we have our own jay, and they were confined to South Wicklow 100 years ago. And now they're everywhere. It's absolutely amazing. So they've actually spread into Scotland apparently. So the subspecies Hibernica of the Irish jay has done really, really well in the last 100 years. That's really good news. Somebody was talking about, is there any good news? But like that, so they're the gardener bird. They're carrying the acorns distances. So I was trying to work out, well, how does this actually work? How do they actually do that? And they create stashes, and some of those stashes get forgotten about, and a new oak emerges as a result. That's just another from above shot of this finger of woodland running through the blanket bog. This is Garton in the centre of the county, and this is kind of like an old estate woodland, but it's also an ancient woodland. So you get these examples on these old estates where the estate is established, the big house is built, the native woodlands are there, and then they plant into that beech and all these other exotic conifers and all the rest of it. That's what you've got. Now this is a totally neglected one of these places where the indigenous native stuff has really made a big comeback. So again, you have this fantastic mix of ash and oak, but also beech. Beech is mostly the one you will see in these woodlands. And then there's these magnificent big oaks. And I'm looking at these oaks and I'm trying to figure out how old they might be, because they're also a really important indicator of ancient woodland. And it's really hard to accurately age oaks. And this particular tree, I think, is maybe kind of close to 300 years old. It's huge, and it's a canopy tree. It's on the next level up that you sort of rarely see in Donegal. So it's towering above the other trees. So there's another level to it. And that's a fantastic indicator of really healthy woodland, where you have big canopy trees and then an understory of other sized trees, and then shrub layer and herb layer. Like that's the base of the tree. One of the wonderful indicators of ancient woodland is the bird cherry, Dunrusk, another beautiful Irish name. The more further north into Ulster you get, the more bird cherry you get. So kind of Ulster is the home of bird cherry. You get it in the south, but you tend to more get wild apple, yeah? In the south. It occupies a similar place. You know, the three native prunuses that we have, Prunus spinosa, the blackthorn, Prunus padus, the bird cherry, and Prunus avium, the wild cherry, they also all sucker. All of them produce sucker, so they've more than one way of reproducing. They can just create their own thicket by travelling and putting up new shoots. And in many of our woodlands in Donegal, there's a lot of presence of an understory of bird cherry that's just suckering itself, waiting for a chance to get out into the light and produce flowers and stuff like that. So it's a very important understory plant. And of course, the lungwort is a famous ancient woodland indicator. And then in the same woodland, there are these lovely patches of hazel with bluebells, and that's where you get the orchids. That's the entrance into Garton Loch. So it's an outdoor pursuit centre, so they run outdoor education programs, canoeing on the lake and all that kind of stuff. But it's a marvellous example of a kind of a modern initiative where they're doing outdoor pursuit training, and the woodland they use for doing mapping and orienteering. But the woodland is basically thriving because of neglect. Now there's some invasive stuff that needs to be dealt with, but actually it's in a pretty good state. That's just an example from the forest floor of a branch of a tree, like a small tree that fell down, became completely covered in wood sorrel with the bluebells all around it. This is Cochin in central Donegal as well. That's mostly oak, all of that. And you can see just about looking down through it, through the sort of bare trees, all the evergreen, that's all holly and ivy. Forest floor, all these beautiful examples of wood sanicle, wild strawberry, bluebell, pignut, and tamarisk moss, which is this little fella over here. Wet patches in our woodlands, again, give incredible diversity. So this is a wet patch, and you have hart's tongue, time moss, and an anemone and caltha. So caltha is kingcup. So a lot of the time we kind of associate certain wildflowers with kind of meadows or outside places, but you find them in our woods a lot as well. So this is one of the really good places in Donegal. This is Ballyar Woods. The woodland was part of this estate, Ballyar House. The woodland is now a nature reserve. It's an incredible example of a beautifully thriving native woodland where everything about the woodland is in very, very good shape. So there's a really good age class of trees. There's a really good diversity. The flora itself within the woods is incredibly rich. So there's a really rich, beautiful tapestry of herbs in the woodland. That's kind of also an example of where some grazing would have taken place. You can see how open that is, that woodland. There's no shrub layer, but there's a bluebell there. That's nearly always an indicator that this woodland has been grazed. Yeah, so that's that dynamic that's been going on since prehistory of grazing animals that's been brought into the woods. They're now totally excluded. There's no grazing animals in this wood because it's now a nature reserve. And as a result, the herb layer will start to develop and become much richer. So Gran Archon and Lusnageha, the two typical, the blue and white of the lesser celandine and anemone, the green hair-streaked butterfly, the early purple orchid, that's particular to Ballyar Woods. Quite close by to Ballyar Woods is the Irish whitebeam, and there's one like mother tree in a hedgerow, and from that mother tree there's all these other smaller trees. So there's a whole population of just, sorbices are like microspecies and they're apomictic, so they produce their own seed without even having to fertilize themselves. So as a result, you get these microspecies, so you get these micropopulations. Beautiful plant, actually, the Irish whitebeam. It's a particularly nice tree to grow. And then there's Prunus avium that suckered itself along a hedgerow. So you find that in the landscape where it just runs along a hedgerow and you get it flowering in the springtime. This is Mulroy Bay in North Donegal. And on Mulroy Bay, I was involved with Ardnaculla about 20 years ago, and there was a stand of spruce on this island, right? And it took us about 5 years of committee meetings to decide to get rid of the spruce. And then when we got rid of the spruce and got them off the island, myself and another fellow, Noel Foley, went in with a bag of birch seed from Glenveagh that I'd collected, and we just scattered it on the island, on the bare needles of this place that had just been clear felled. And we got a woodland in an hour. So sometimes, having the right intervention at the right time, timing is amazing if you can get your timing right. In North Donegal on Rathmullen, this is a big oak woodland that has also been planted with beech. That's beech on the right and this is oak on the left. Can you see the difference? The beech is kind of purple and the oak is kind of white, and that's because of all the lichens also that are on the oak. That's it, the same thing from above. And then this is inside the oak woodland. Now that's pretty good going for an oak woodland because you have plants and herbs and shrubs at every layer. And under oak, you get light penetration that you don't get under beech. I'm going to show you that now. But can you see the way there's this light penetration right to the surface? Right to the sort of ground surface. And that's what gives you this amazing diversity. This is the same place under beech. So you just don't get all of that stuff. So beech is not good. I don't think it's an invasive species, but like we need to all needs to be thinned out and let the oak move back into that woodland. More the same. Looking closely at the leaves to see what makes an Irish oak an Irish oak. So the narrowing of the leaf to the petiole, the absence of these little auricles at the end of the leaf. There's also other things to do with the leaf shape. So the thing about oak is that half the time when you're looking at an oak in Ireland, you're looking at a hybrid between one species and the other. And we have to take that on board. So a hybrid oak is just as good as one of the other species. Yeah? They just happen to cross with each other quite readily. This is one of the biggest native woodlands in the country, probably. Yeah, I need to stop soon. This is Carrow-Doan, right? Privately owned land. Several different people own this woodland. It's 200 hectares That's as good, that's as big as it gets, right? And I'm kind of looking at this going, you can see where the woodland has been cleared as well. You see these little fields? That's all been cleared probably relatively recently. That's all in private hands. It's part of the Lochswilly SAC, so they kind of included it in one of these big SACs, so it's got some level of protection, but there's no plan or management plan to kind of, that's close to medieval landscape, what bigger patches of Ireland look like, this kind of scrub woodland or oak woodland. So, and then you can see there's little white patches in it. That's Prunus padus, an ancient woodland indicator. There it is again, on the sort of edges of the woods flowering. I love this place. This is Fedi Glass. So on Faiha Glass, the Green Woods, yeah? Beautiful name, and it's in East Donegal. So in East Donegal is fabulous, fertile land, and somehow this tiny little ancient woodland has survived in the middle of it, which is fantastic. And again, it has both cherries. It has Prunus avium and Prunus padus. And this is the interior. That is what you want to look at in a really thriving woodland where it's nearly closed in. Do you see that? It's got every level has got stuff going on in it. And that's the Prunus padus in the understory of Fedi Glass. One of the ways you can get a really good indication that this is an ancient woodland. And it's continuous throughout the wood. Like there's loads of it. Like it's really lots of it, which is very, very interesting. So it's one of the best sites in Donegal for Prunus padus. This is Glenveagh. So ancient woodlands, this has been declared. We definitely are saying this is definitely an ancient woodland. They survived because of the lakeside location. It's a lot of it is hybrid. There's also an awful lot of yew, for example, in our woodlands, which makes it very, very interesting. It's the only native woodland in Donegal that has substantial, like probably hundreds of yew trees. That's a lot, like. And I have to say that every single woodland that I've ever visited, they're all different. They all have their own unique species mix. They all have their own story and reason for being there. So even though we classify all these things in different ways, into different groupings, into different vegetation types and all the rest of it, they're all absolutely unique and they all deserve protection. Just in the last couple of years, we've been working on a native woodland strategy in Glenveagh, and it's currently on the minister's desks, which is great to be getting it to a point. So it's a 100-year plan, right, for our woodlands. And it's the first time NPWS have done that. So we're going to see more of it. The rest of the national parks are going to be doing the same thing. We just managed to get ahead of the posse in some ways. And it's a 100-year plan, and it involves tackling the deer numbers, doing a dramatic reduction of the deer numbers, tackling the invasive species, which is a huge, we're probably 90% there with tackling the invasive species, but what we're working on at the moment is putting the resources in place to do all the follow-up after you've cleared your invasive species. So there's a lot of more work that has to happen in the woods to protect them so they don't get reinvaded. That's the big one. And one of the things we're doing is we're setting up a native plant nursery in the garden. We've got it started and we're growing stuff where we're going to look at doing nature restoration of particularly compromised woodlands.